誰かが喋り出したらもういいよしてっていう感じ。
終わったらトレーニングデータもいただければ、もし本当にお調べにアップするんであれば、このカメラが一番いいカメラなんで。
そうですね、綺麗で高いし。そんなに来ると思ってなかったんで、朝はもうちょい減るだろうっていう予想で。そうすると早速お昼が問題になって、なんであげないっていう。心理で買ってもらうか、高校食堂に行ってもらうっていうひどいパターンですね。昨日またそういう社員さんが激怒してて。
心理やってるんですか？
なんかやってるらしいんですよ。やってなかったらもうあれだみたいな。おしまいだと。みんな帰っちゃうと。
あれですもんね。緑の面とかっていうボランティア講座がついてるから、なんか体操してますよね。ちょっと準備さんが上手です。
Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the symposium co-sponsored by SSRI at ICU and Institute of Global Concern at Sophia University. And this year's symposium topic is Beyond Nationalism, ? And my name is Akazuki Moriya, Professor of International Relations at ICU. And I'm very pleased to invite important guests here today. And first of all, I would like to pass the microphone to Professor Junko Hibiya, President of ICU, for opening remarks.
Professor Mori. I would like to welcome all of you to ICU campus. We are very happy to host this symposium every year. Each year we take turns, Sophia University and ICU host this very important symposium. And this is the 34th symposium, which the two institutions jointly sponsor. And this year it is joined by the Peace Research Institute at the International Christian University as well. As many of you know, ICU celebrated a 60th anniversary last year, and Sophia University celebrated 100th anniversary last year, so we were 40 years apart, almost like parent and child. And 34th, that means like out of the 60 years of existence of ICU, more than half we have been organizing this symposium. That means this has a very long tradition, and this is a great driving force of social science research at our institution and also at Sophia University. This year, I would like to thank particularly to Professor Kaviraj, am I pronouncing your name correct? From Columbia University as the keynote speaker, and also several other professors from abroad who are sitting in the center table, and they will be joined by some more later. Today, there will be a keynote speech, a plenary session discussion, presentations, and so on and so forth. I hope this symposium entitled Beyond Nationalism will be another new stage for more development in our joint research, and I hope everybody benefits greatly from joining us today. Thank you very much. I would also like to mention that since the weather is going to be quite nice, it's probably not so cold. So if you have time, please do enjoy walking around our campus, particularly going towards that direction where you can enjoy the nature of Musashino plant very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, President Hibiya. And now, Professor Giorgio Shani, he's a director of ICU's SSRI. He will make an explanation on the overview of the symposium topic.
Okay, first I would like to sincerely thank the president of ICU, Hibiya Sensei, for taking time to address us. I think it's particularly apt since she is a graduate of Sophia University, as well as the president of ICU. So thank you very much for sparing time in your busy schedule for giving the introductory remarks for this event. My name is Giorgio Shani. As Professor Mori introduced me, I am director of the Social Science Research Institute. And it's a great honor for me to be able to invite you and to welcome you to ICU. It is a particular honor to be able to invite you to attend this symposium, which directly relates not only to my research interests, but to what I consider to be one of the most pressing themes and pressing problems in global politics today, and arguably for the last century. So this symposium will address the theme of nationalism, but it'll address the theme of nationalism in a critical perspective. By critical perspective, I mean that we'll be questioning the assumptions which underpin nationalism. And also, and this is the job of the question mark, we'll be looking at opportunities and possibilities of going beyond nationalism. I would like to thank in advance the presenters and the participants for sparing time in their very busy schedules to be with us today. I will introduce them all in very briefly at the end of this presentation. Okay, so by way of introduction, I would like to go through the theme of the symposium, which should be included in the program, the objective of the symposium, and I'd like to introduce you to perhaps the central figure of the symposium, Rabindranath Tagore. If it wasn't for Tagore's work, this symposium would not be possible. I'll briefly introduce Tagore's stance on nationalism, which will be covered in the keynote address by Professor Kaviraj later, and something which perhaps will not be covered within the presentations, which is Tagore's views on nationalism in Japan. So what's particularly important when we look at Rabindranath Tagore's work is that he did come to Japan almost 100 years ago, and he addressed the issue of nationalism in Japan. Arguably, Japan is as nationalist today as it was 98 years ago. We will examine this in the second plenary session, where we have keynote addresses by Professor Chiba and Professor Nakano. We'll be looking at lessons which we can learn for modern Japan from Tagore's writings, and finally I'll be concluding by looking at the structure of the symposium. Okay, in terms of the theme of the symposium, The centenary commemorations of the First World War serve as a stark reminder of the perils of nationalism, which have as yet remained unheeded throughout Asia. In a lecture given in Japan as the war unfolded in 1916, the Bengali poet and Nobel Laureate Rabindranath Tagore criticized the nation state and offered a vision of a society independent of it. The 20th century, however, saw a proliferation of nationalist ideology throughout the region and the establishment of an international society of nation states. The history of the 20th century was the history of nationalism. In terms of the objective of the symposium, we'll be focusing on the present. So in recent years, particularly in this area, we have seen a revival of nationalism. This is pronounced within South Asia and also within Northeast Asia. And arguably, this has threatened peace and stability in the region, most notably in the dispute, the simmering dispute over the Senkaku Daioh Islands. As a result of the election held last week, there is a possibility, if they're willing, for the ruling LDP, Jiminto Alliance, to change the Japanese constitution to allow Japan to engage in offensive actions overseas. So we're seeing a period of change. This symposium, the 34th joint symposium held by SSRI and the Institute for Global Concern at Sophia University, will seek to critically interrogate the prospects for peace in Asia by posing the following question: what can be done to counter the rise of nationalism within Asia? So the argument which we're making is that nationalism is an ideology which has a propensity for violence and which has a propensity for conflict. Nationalism is not an ideology which is confined to a particular state or nation state. It's not specific to Japan. It's not specific to Germany or Italy or other of the classic nation states of the 19th century. This is a universal phenomenon and a universal problem. Okay, I would like to very briefly introduce you to the man on your right, Rabindranath Tagore, who came to Japan 98 years ago. So he's a Bengali author and poet from a upper caste zamindari family. Zamindaris would be landed owners from a very wealthy family, but somebody who distanced himself from colonial rule. He's author of many books. I think there are 3 books in particular which deal with themes which are germane to the conference: Gora, Home and the World, and 4 chapters. He was the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And I think, interestingly, he was committed to anti-colonialism. India was a colony of Britain at the time. So he was an anti-colonial nationalist who returned his knighthood after a massacre in Amritsar in 1919, which saw the British Army firing upon unarmed civilians. However, he was deeply critical of the ideology of nationalism and its propensity for violence. So in the introduction to his book on nationalism, E.P. Thompson mentioned that his writing was almost prophetic or prescient in terms of predicting what would happen within the 20th century. He first came to Japan in 1916 to give a lecture on nationalism during the height of the First World War. And this actually forms the background to a lot of his critique of the West. So there's usually a conflation in his writing. People consider him to be critiquing the West or Western civilization per se. He was critiquing, at least in my understanding, a particular aspect of Western civilization. If we are to look at Tagore's writing on nationalism, as I briefly mentioned, he made a clear distinction between anti-colonialism and nationalism. In a recent book by Ashish Nandi, he characterizes Tagore's position as being based on a conception of the illegitimacy of nationalism, a preference for patriotism rather than nationalism. I think this is an important point to make, considering that Rabindranath Tagore is the author of 2 national anthems, the national anthem of India and also the national anthem of Bangladesh. In the keynote presentation, immediately after my comments, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj will give a different view in terms of its culture, in terms of its appreciation for beauty, but he was critical of the mimicry of Japanese modernity, and particularly Japanese nationalism, which was seen as an empty mimicry of the West. He argued that what is dangerous for Japan is not the imitations of the outer features of the West, but the acceptance of the motive force for Western nationalism as her own. So it's the deepening of nationalist sentiment, the identification which people have for the nation and putting the nation above all else. Japan, he argued, must have a firm faith in the moral law of existence to be able to assert to herself that the Western nations are following that path of suicide, where they are smothering their humanity in order to keep themselves in power and hold others in subjection. So we can see, again, Rabindranath Tagore rejecting the idea not only of Japanese nationalism, but Japanese nationalism as leading to imperialism. An argument which will be made in the third session will be to re-examine the link between Japanese nationalism and anti-colonialism. So an argument of Okakura Tenshin and others in that period was that Japanese imperialism was seen as necessary for liberating Asia from Western domination. This was an argument which Tagore rejected in advance. In terms of lessons for modern Japan, again from a quotation from his book on nationalism, he argued, "I do not for a moment suggest that Japan should be unmindful of acquiring modern weapons of self-protection." So in this sense, he wasn't a complete pacifist, but this should never be allowed to go beyond her instinct of self-preservation. This nicely leads on to our second plenary session, which will be examining Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. So therefore, Tagore's argument here can be seen as foreshadowing Article 9 of the Constitution, which commits the Japanese nation to forever renouncing war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Okay, turning to the structure of the symposium. It is divided into 3 sessions. The first plenary session would look at beyond nationalism, would look at Tagore's and engage with Tagore's work. The second plenary session would look at contemporary developments within Japan. The third session will look at nationalism, religion, critical nationalism. I think Gandhi once said to Rabindranath Tagore that he considered him to be a Gurudev, which is something like, it's a higher form of sensei in this sense. So that's how I feel in a way to the work of Professor Kaviraj, who's inspired me for many years. The second keynote presentation would be by our distinguished Professor Chiba Sensei on Japanese politics at the crossroad and the future of East Asia. Professor Chiba will be retiring formally as a professor in March of this year, but he'll be continuing as a Tokunin Kyoju, as a specially appointed professor. And he's also head of the Peace Research Institute. So it's a great opportunity and honor for us to honor his work. And finally, I'd like to thank in particular Professor Koichi Nakano for making time in his busy schedule, crisscrossing the world, to come back to ICU on his sabbatical to give a talk on history, politics, and identity in Japan. So we have 3 keynote presentations, one from ICU, one from Sophia, and one from Columbia University. Turning to presentations, we're delighted, or I'm really delighted to announce and to be able to introduce to you 4 excellent presentations. Papers are available for presenters. The first by Professor Kwak from Seongsil University, Republic of Korea, directly engages with the main theme of the symposium, which was to look really at the relationship between religion, nationalism, and peace building. Religious nationalism, reciprocal non-domination. This is an excellent paper, and I'm really looking forward to its presentation. Following on from that theme, Professor Atsuko Ichijo from Kingston University in the UK and a former ICU graduate we'll be looking at moments of subversion and resistance, unintended consequences of nationalist imperialist ideas in the Japanese Empire. Now, this is exceptionally under-researched, and it's a very important paper. There's a lot of literature in South Asia which looks at the dissemination of nationalist thought and the way in which it wasn't so much internalized, but used by nationalists against imperial rule. There hasn't been a systematic study of this with relation to Japanese nationalism. Forming the backdrop to the debates within the first two papers is Professor Kosuke Shimizu's paper on Buddhism, reason, and the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Area, multiculturalism and nationalism in the pre-war period. So we have two papers which directly engage critically with the pre-war period and also with the lessons which contemporary Japan can learn from it. And finally, I'm delighted to announce that Professor Takeshi Deguchi from Todai will be with us, and he'll be bringing us up to date by looking at two types of nationalism in modern Japan: authoritarian dictatorship and narcissistic aggressiveness. Okay, I hope you enjoy the symposium. Before we conclude, I would like to ask you, if possible, it is a tradition at ICU to observe a moment of silence. And I think it is particularly apt to do so in order to commemorate those who died in the Great War 100 years ago and in other forms of nationalist violence, including religious nationalist violence, the religious nationalist violence which we saw, unfortunately, last week unfold in Pakistan with the killing of 135 school kids in Peshawar. So if we could end in a moment of silence, I'll be very grateful. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, let's get started for the first plenary sessions. And as Professor Shani mentioned, this is a centenary anniversary of outbreak of World War I. And 90 years ago, Rabindranath Tagore visited Japan, and he criticized Japan's 21 demand on China by arguing that this Japan's action was against a traditional Japanese sense of beauty, as Okakura Tenshi mentioned. And also, Professor Kabiraji's presentation will be really timely. Actually, as compared to the Indian Constitution and Japanese Constitution, Indian Constitution has been amended about 100 times so far, on average twice a year. And on the other hand, Japanese possible constitution not amended as a language. However, in substance, as you mentioned, many of us are worrying about the de facto amendment of the Japan's constitutions. And I thought why this kind of difference? Both countries, both non-Western countries are struggling about the constitutionalism. And I look forward to find some answers from Professor Kabiraji's presentations. And also, he will talk about three key points about Tagore's critical perspective of nationalism. And I think we can find out some implications for pre-modern, modern, and postmodern evolution of or integration of what kind of a nationalism should be find out. So, as we would like to pass a microphone to Professor Kabiraji, and he, as I already mentioned, he's currently a professor of Indian politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. And before joining the Columbia University, he taught at the SOAS of University of London. And his publications include the imaginary institution of India. And I think the most recent book of his work is closely related to today's topic. So, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful to you for the invitation to speak at this conference. It deals with a very important problem. I'm also particularly pleased with your discernment in deciding to focus on Rabindranath Tagore, who is, I think, an unusual and particularly insightful thinker on these questions. Nationalism in its varying forms, European imperialist nationalism and anti-colonial nationalism in the colonies, these were the two forms of nationalism that Tagore saw during his life, were shaping the world throughout the span of Tagore's life. And he looked at these convulsions with great attention and rare insight. His peculiarity lay in the fact that, unlike most intellectuals of his time, he did not embrace the simple solution of deciding which side to support. He decided to observe critically the strange impulses that emerged from the nationalist sentiment and provided a critique of both sides, not just imperialist Europe. Nationalist sentiment associated with religious communities has re-emerged as a powerful force in our own times, though not in forms prevalent in Tagore's world. Thus, there is a straight connection between the question that fascinated and troubled him and the questions that trouble us today. The intellectual world that Tagore created is one of great beauty, but what is not always grasped is also of great intellectual complexity. Apart from being a producer of great art, he was also a producer of social thought, of very unusual insights, with a strange and, to my mind, a very unordinary vision. It was able to see much about the world of his times that others, who were more obvious social thinkers, often did not grasp. I've argued elsewhere that he was an unusually astute analyst of the nature of modern power, and his complex reflections on nationalism form part of that very insightful corpus of political theory. There's a widespread but erroneous view that accounts for the rise of nationalism in Asian societies like Japan, China, and India in a simple diffusionist way. The prejudice that all significant things originate in Europe and then gradually circulate to the rest of the world is so deeply entrenched that we often accept a casual, inattentive, entirely diffusionist theory of the spread of modern nationalism. Through the accumulation of several mutually reinforcing processes of modernity, this theory goes, it produces an unprecedented connection of intimacy and ownership between political subjects and their state, which was known as nationalism. It was not merely the power of capitalist economic productivity that enabled the expansion of Western power across the world, but its coupling with this entirely new form of collective belonging and identity. Once other societies saw the immensity of the effect of this force in modern history that lay behind the dominance of modern Europe, all societies started emulating this sentiment. That is the crude version of this textbook, History of Nationalism. Historically minded people will realize that this story is woefully inadequate and misleading. There is no doubt that many Asian observers thought that the strange fact that a small number of people from a distant island, I'm thinking primarily of India, could navigate the world and conquer India could not be simply explained by the power of military technology. After all, military techniques could be easily mastered by Asian people. I'm here giving you a summary of something that goes on quite a lot in the very early discussions of Indian nationalism. Military techniques, after all, could be easily mastered by Asian people. What gave the Europeans an ability to deliver a superior form of force was a peculiar organization of their state apparatus. and the chemistry of an affect which produced an unprecedented form of collective intentionality and collective action. This was the invention of the nation state. The negative experience of European colonization made this sentiment attractive to the elites of colonized societies. Intelligent observers from Asia prefigured in their analysis of European power some of the disciplinary features later examined by Foucault. It's quite interesting to read some of the early Indian nationalists. It feels sometimes that we are reading Foucault. And this gave rise to a similar envy for forms of collective intention and collective action. But it was not easy to introduce this new idea, and in this I think Tagore is particularly important, even to linguistically express it with precision and clarity in Indian languages. In India, Bengal was the first region in which these questions began to be raised in its intellectual culture, simply because it was the region which was subjected to British rule for the longest time. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, a novelist, satirist, and political essayist, first wrote of the need for anti-colonial opposition to British rule, but it was not easy to introduce this novel idea that Indians should begin to think of themselves as a nation. Often, Bankim, when he wrote about this theme, would signal the awkwardness and absence of an equivalent term in Bengali by using the telling phrase, what the English called the nation. He would write in Bengali, but he would say what the English called the nation. Bankim Chandra's works were pioneering in two senses. They showed both the newness and the vagueness of the pioneering idea. Though Bankim wrote passionately to persuade his compatriots that they should oppose British power, there remained a fatal ambiguity in his thinking. The jati, that this is the Bengali term, that was to take on the historic task of opposing British rule was oddly unspecified in his work. At times it seemed it was the task of the Bengalis who should become the nation, at others of the Hindus or of the Indians, which were very different solutions to the same problem and had very different implications for the character of subsequent nationalism. Bankim was surely a passionate anti-imperialist, but strangely, he had not yet chosen his nation. By the time Rabindranath Tagore became a young intellectual, a prolific writer of poetry, fiction, and serious political commentary, nationalism had become a familiar idea, and Bengalis were viewing with intense interest the dramatic unification processes unfolding in Italy and Germany, and reading with reverent attention the works of Mazzini in English translation. But this unfamiliar new sentiment, which could sweep everything before it, took form and expression through a British decision to divide the province of Bengal into an eastern and a western part in 1905. Though the ostensible reason was an administrative convenience, as Bengal was an unwieldy large territorial unit, research has now convincingly shown that their objectives were less benign. A split in the province would create two entities which would be statistically dominated by two religious communities, Hindus on the west and Muslims on the east, likely to fuel discord between their elites and thus retard the demands for self-government by the Indians, which was emerging by this time. The partition of Bengal evoked a massive popular response, and it created for the first time in Indian history the peculiar combination of elite intellectual and popular mobilization against foreign rule. A relatively young intellectual at the time, Tagore supported the growing mass movement enthusiastically. But Tagore practiced a peculiar form of participation, taking part in the action and observing the consequences of the actions at the same time. As the Swadeshi movement ended after 3 years of political convulsions, with some success, because the British actually withdrew the move of dividing Bengal, two divergent views of political action derived utterly different conclusions from a retrospective analysis of what had happened. For ordinary political activists and intellectuals, the Swadeshi movement showed, first of all, that the power of the British colonial state was not entirely unanswerable. A decision of the British government at the high point of imperial power could really be thwarted by a movement, which is a new thing, an entirely new form of political action. Western educated intellectuals knew about the powers of such movements from their reading of the history of modern Europe, but it was unprecedented in Indian history. Political intellectuals began thinking about what could be the ways in which such mass mobilizations could be better organized and directed towards larger goals, for instance, independence from British rule. Rabindranath's reflections took a wholly different direction. He looked closely into the stages through which the movement had evolved and what happened inside every stage, and his analytical conclusions were more complex. When the Swadeshi movement gained strength, he was exultantly in support of this cause, but like all popular movements, as it expanded in its influence and support, it also became more complex, developed many strands of mobilization and political action. Two types of development created concern in Tagore's mind. The first was an intensification of activist enthusiasm into terrorist action against individual British functionaries. This was the first eruption of terrorism in India. Terrorism profoundly troubled Tagore's consciousness because of its immense heroic attractiveness to the youth and its colossal waste of idealistic lives, its futility as a political technique. But Tagore also discovered that as the movement intensified, mobilizers became more ferocious and desperate to increase the force of popular power. What I'm trying to argue here is, which is not in this script, is that as the Swadeshi movement became more powerful, it developed different strands, and one strand was the strand of heroic individual action to intensify this kind of activity. The other strand was not of heroic individual action, but heroic collective action, that you persuade a large number of people to come together and engage in a mass movement. But he was critical in two different ways of both these new trends. But Tagore also discovered that as the movement intensified, mobilizers became more ferocious and desperate to increase the force of popular power. And Hindu activists began to use appeals of Hindu religion, eliciting similar processes of resistance similar responses of resistance from Muslim groups opposed to the movement. For Tagore, this was a strangely frustrating outcome of a popular mobilization which brought out deep democratic energies of politics, widened participation, but also mobilized the darkest forces of atavism. Associated with this were deeper causes of concern. In mobilizing popular numbers, politicians not merely showed unconcern for religious divisions and felt happy if they could mobilize large groups of people, despite the cost of antagonizing an equally large number, creating a large mobilized popular force, but at the same time threatening to rip apart the fabric of everyday neighborliness between Hindus and Muslims. It was a travesty of the dream of a mobilized people. The dream had turned into a nightmare. From the troubled field of political life, after the apparent success of the Swadeshi agitation, Tagore retreated into the internal field of his artistic imagination, where his thought was untrammeled by constraints of reality. And he could depict, without hindrance, the logic of these strands of dark populist politics, which would either make freedom impossible, it might bring into reality an entirely travestied version of independence. He was not a stranger to the conflicts of political debate, but an unenthusiastic controversialist. In the debates, he appears as an unenthusiastic combatant, restrained continually by demands of civility towards his adversaries. But within the world of his authorial sovereignty, in the world of his imagination, he was free to create characters and situations which would reveal the logic of disaster, which outer social reality did not show with remorseless clarity. His novels were his path to the truth of history. Three of his novels are concerned with both personal and collective pictures of nationalist politics. But their intellectual force consists in the fact that unlike standard forms of political theory, they capture processes at three different levels. They offer a profound analysis of the transformation of individual personalities when they get immersed in politics, the business of transforming their societies by directed political collective action. Politics is not an activity that occurs only at the level of larger social processes. Its effects reach deep into the inner recesses of the individual's mind, sensibility, and his use of reason. It is only one kind of personality that can succeed in the special field of activity we call modern politics. That is a personality that subordinates to individual political calculation the consideration of effects in the lives of real people, a personality that sacrifices at the level of personal rationality the Wert rational to the Zweck rational, to use Weber's dichotomy. Political rationality has significant effects on the life of the political group itself. There is a tendency towards natural degeneration in the character of terrorist cells and of the large mass movements as they evolve towards greater power and maturity. Through systematic substitution of the instrumental for the morally rational, they become massive collective instruments of self-aggrandizement of large groups, which learn how to maneuver in the political world and corner, neutralize, and humiliate other large social groups, which will be obliged in their turn to enter into a spiraling exchange of hostility. Finally, in their large historical consequence, such movements are likely to damage their societies by polarizing them through the contestation of more lethally organized power than was the condition before. Critical reflections of this kind were expressed in Tagore's writings in two forms: in a series of critical essays, which was the favorite form of political commentators, and a series of novels around political themes. In my view, therefore, to read Tagore's mind on modern politics, we must see his analytic intention distributed between his political writings and his imaginative work on the fictive world of real but unrealized possibilities. Two of his novels explored the logic of deformation of modern political movements, The Home and the World, and the Four Chapters. In the first, which has been turned into a film by the great filmmaker Satyajit Ray, Tagore prepares a narrative of artistic exploration of a single political career. Shondip, its main protagonist, begins his political career in a genuine idealistic attachment to his nation, but gradually, by exaggerating the importance of this cause over all others, generates two types of manipulative action. First, he becomes adept at exploiting individual relationships and developing an illicit attachment to the wife of his closest friends, subordinating her to his desire and treating her as a means to the noble cause of the nation. And secondly, he incites a communal religious frenzy, which incites great excitement for the national ideal, but degrades it by imposing an exclusive definition, Hindu definition, from which some of its inhabitants are excluded. But politics is an activity of imperfect control. Leaders like Shondip can create a frenzy of enthusiasm, but cannot guide its direction. When the fire he lights gets out of control, and the fight for the motherland degenerates into a war between Hindus and Muslims, in this novel, the politician slinks away with the excuse that as the leader, he had the supreme responsibility to preserve his own life above everyone else's, so that he can start his noble and incessant fight for his country's freedom at some other time, in some other place. We get a sense that Shondip will inevitably succeed. He will reappear in the same role in some other context and affect the lives of others close to himself and lead other communities which had lived as neighbors for centuries into a kind of bonfire of the peace. His second novel, Charodhai, depicts the gradual descent of the life of another youth into utterly futile political sacrifice. So the first is a critique of the mass movement. This one is a critique of individual heroic terrorist action. His idealism leads him to a feeling of guilt about his comfortable upper-class life and draws him, by contrast, towards a group of terrorists. To a feeling of guilt about his they entice him into acts of violence, which he finds repugnant while doing them, but he teaches himself to accept them as revolutionary discipline. His descent into a vortex of violence inevitably draws with him his woman friend, who is an object of lust to other revolutionaries without scruples. Abandonment of restraint in one field of life inevitably spread to others into a nihilistic repudiation of all moral rules. Eventually, the narrative, which Tagore in his characteristic style ends by suggestion rather than by clear diegetic finality, shows a denouement in which the lives of two promising young lovers are destroyed without much benefit to the motherland. The lure of the revolutionary public life does not succeed in transforming the life of the society, only in destroying the ideal of private happiness. Placing these two narratives together, we can get a sense of Tagore's deepening concern, quite similar in some respect to Gandhi's. He saw modernity as a combination of historical forces, which irreversibly altered the nature of power. It placed political power at the center and at the top of a society in a way that was historically unprecedented. Through endogenous modernity, as in Europe or Japan, or colonial intrusion of modern politics, as in countries like India, politics became a dominant force in modern societies everywhere. This was entirely unlike historical pre-modern societies. But this politics is all-powerful. It does not allow people to ignore it. It does not allow any place to hide from its tentacles. Modern people must make it a principal object of their historical thinking. I shall argue at the end that there is a strangely unsatisfactory quality to Tagore's thinking about modern power. He arrived at conclusions that were finally theoretically anti-political and remained caught in a paradox, arguing intellectually that politics could not be marginalized in social life of modern societies, yet exhorting people to take a stance that disallowed politics the power to dominate all forms of social life. Although this eventual position maneuvered him into a rather strange position in political theory, I think he arrived at that conclusion through some brilliant reflection on the effects of politics on modern life. I would like to argue that there are three major innovations in Tagore's political thought, and I shall speak about each of them in turn before concluding with what I think is of real value in Tagore's thinking about political modernity. The first element of great value is Tagore's exploration of the relation between words and the world. His growing perception that new practical ideas like nation, state, etc. were making an entry into Indian social life, altering and breaking the coherence of its older categorical language, the grammar of language itself. Second, he slowly developed nothing short of an interesting theory of power in modern societies. And finally, he fashioned a consistent critical reflection on the idea of the nation, a strangely sophisticated conception of what can only be described as a critical nationalism. So the first one, this is more about language. Tagore was particularly perceptive in noticing that the nation and the state were two new concepts that invaded the political moral imaginary and vocabulary of modern India. Somewhat like Gandhi, Tagore thought that the main problem with colonialism was not subjection in sovereignty, but subjection to the modern social imaginary, which made sovereignty the center of all attention and collective activity. Introduction of these practical concepts carried the promise to unrepentant modernists and a threat to thinkers like Tagore and Gandhi of restructuring the most fundamental relations in Indian society. Colonialism, by denying sovereignty to the society, made people focus on it perversely, and Indian society was gradually becoming habituated to the idea that all significant initiatives affecting society must come from the source, Raja Shakti, that is the power of the state or political power, rather than Atma Shakti, that is the power of the self, the power of the society organized as a collective self. Associative powers lodged in society itself. For Tagore, pre-modern Indian society was not state-centric, and the affliction of colonialism was twofold. It was only the obvious problem with colonialism that political sovereignty passed into the hands of the British, alien rulers from Europe. But those nationalists who saw that as the exclusive problem of colonialism did not have a deep vision of what was really historically wrong with colonial subjection. In an underlying sense, the problem was the problem of sovereignty itself, imposition of a regime of the modern sovereign state, which surrendered all other authorities in social life to a comprehensive domination by the material and ethical dominance of the state. It would be a tragedy, Tagore thought, if this regime became permanent, even though Indians came to acquire this sovereign power. Gandhi also said the same thing, that if we keep the same thing and power comes to the British, it's not an end of colonialism, at least not an end of dominance. Interestingly, this diagnosis was exactly parallel to Gandhi's argument in Hind Swaraj. Dominance by an Indian elite, which continued with the same regime of modernity, would simply be a colonization in a different form, a permanent historic defeat of Indian civilization. Of course, as is well known, there were highly significant differences between Tagore and Gandhi about modernity and Western civilization, to which Giorgio, I think, insightfully pointed. Tagore's opposition was not as comprehensive as Gandhi's. He did not view the entire civilization of Western modernity as a degrading force, only some of its constituents. But they thought with remarkable clarity regarding the logic of the modern state and techniques of modern power. Tagore argued with intense passion that India had never known a concept like the nation, whose feeling of community was based on the members' common link to the state. People and state were linked by a strange notion of mutual ownership, and it becomes apparent through the narrative developments of his novel Gora that his major concern was about the homogeneity demanded and celebrated by the idea of a European-style nation-state. His novel, Gora, was meant as a critique of this ideal, which was gaining increasing popularity in Indian political opinion. A subtler stream of the argument could not be missed. It was Tagore's concern that those who got easily persuaded to this fundamental transformation did not even realize that they were converted to an entirely new optics about the social world, because much of this change occurred at a pre-argumentative level of thought. Intellectuals are always self-conscious about putting together arguments from strings of connection between individual ideas. No intellectual can develop an argument about significant subjects entirely unself-consciously. But the substitution in this case was not happening through an explicit argument persuading Indians to change their minds. It was happening through a silent substitution of word meanings, shift of the term state from its pre-modern meaning to another, and a sense of the social community from its pre-modern meaning to the meaning of the word nation. So he has a lot of very interesting discussion about the effectiveness of the language and how the use of these two terms was really altering the structure, the grammar of thought about society and politics. By taking these new concepts of state and nation for granted, Indians were assenting to the greatest transformation of the political world without even thinking about it. That was why it was important to explore the meanings of the two concepts and their implications. To state his new argument about the untenability of the nation in the European sense, Tagore needed a framing argument about the modern state. This was, in my judgment, entirely unprecedented in Indian reflection and captured a profound truth about the modern world. This particular argument has two parts, the first of which is rather similar to one found in the French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville. Tagore is convinced that the modern state is quite unlike states and regimes of power that had existed in earlier historical periods. In many of his literary essays, he uses effective tropes like storms or noise to refer to the power of rulers who sat on top of societies, but did not involve themselves in the everyday lives of societies, making a stark distinction between a society's political and truly social life. What happened on the top layers of political power were cataclysmic, but did not involve the settled rhythms of everyday life, which continued undisturbed through such upheaval. He says in one of his famous essays, even on the day of a great storm, the storm is not the most significant truth, although this is actually the matter of news. The everyday life that occurs wordlessly inside the homes in the sleepy villages is the greater truth of this life. Emergence of the modern state altered this relation irreversibly, creating a new state which had not merely the practical power to dominate all fields, but also carried the ethical sanction for acting on behalf of the society as a whole, reconceived as a nation, which pre-modern political elites never could. This utterly altered the order and structure of social life, placing the state at the center of everything. Pre-modern states could face two kinds of responses, of either being ignored by ordinary people, or being successfully opposed by cliques of powerful dissident aristocrats. The disciplinary power of the modern state could hardly be restrained by these old devices. Social conditions of modernity destroyed the aristocracy, which constituted competitive centers of political and military power in pre-modern times. Atomized ordinary citizens of a modern state simply had no hope of mounting successful opposition to the state. To this point, Tagore's diagnosis of the modern political predicament is entirely parallel to de Tocqueville's. Tocqueville believed that under these conditions, the only serious opposition to the power of the state could be a vibrant civil society, a powerful associational life which did not cede all social initiative to the state. Thinking about the unanswerable power of the modern state created deep anxiety about its political misuse. What if the state, with this unprecedented power, turns unjust or oppressive? One answer to that could be found in constitutionalism, distribution of the state's power among its constituent branches with such institutional ingenuity, which the Federalist Papers, for instance, in America, discusses in great length, with such institutional ingenuity that one agency restrained the power of the other. This was the preferred solution in European and American history. Tagore faced a different historical reality, living in a society under European colonialism. The colonial state was by nature alien to the people it governed, and therefore there was a constitutive injustice in its nature itself. How could an unjust but all-powerful state be challenged? So this was the central question for Tagore's generation in India. How could a crowd of ordinary people, unarmed, unendowed with the power of conventional aristocracy, contest and challenge this unanswerable power in the colonial context? Tagore thought it inevitable that in such situations, popular power would be mobilized through mass movements and deep popular mobilization. This is why the example of the Swadeshi movement was not contingent, but paradigmatic. It was not an event that accidentally happened in India through an unrepeatable combination of circumstances. Such a conjuncture arose repeatedly, inevitably, because of the nature of modern history. The historical field of modern politics opened out between two great protagonists and their contests over political power, states and movements. Not surprisingly, the political history of modernity, inaugurated by the French Revolution, Tagore thought, was primarily a story of states and their conflicts with mass popular movements that opposed them. The colonial state is a typical state of injustice, which required opposition and contestation. If in modern times, the unanswerable power of the state could only be challenged by the counterpower of a disciplinary political movement, which generated its own power through very similar mechanisms of symmetric mass popular collective action, then it followed that the only prospect of an end to foreign domination in India was through a mass popular mobilization about which Tagore had deep concerns. Tagore's own analysis of the nature of political modernity inexorably led him to this conclusion. But again, this led to dismal forebodings of enslavement of free human life by another gigantic incarceration. Although Tagore did not present it as a political program, his solution lay in the patient fashioning of a new theory of collective belonging, for which even he could not find a distinctive name. This is something that I would be happy to discuss if you want later on, because I think in many cases you have new ideas for which we do not have new names initially. And what I want to suggest through this paper is that the theory of collective belonging that Tagore wanted to devise, in one sense should not be called nationalism, but he kept on using the term nationalism, both writing in English and in Bengali. But actually what he means by that, the ideal that he develops is something which is very different from the European-style nationalism of the nation-state. He developed his idea through descriptive elaboration of the precise nature of the sentiment of collective identity. We face a deep linguistic problem here because human beings' language, as Mill said, is always poorer than the ideas that they seek to express. As we are habituated to using the term nationalism to refer to such collective sentiments of belonging or community, people use the word nationalism to refer to this. In one sense, that description is apt. In another, entirely inappropriate. And without understanding this distinction, we cannot grasp Tagore's utterly innovative thinking about the problem of nationalism. It is recognized that the phenomenon of nationalism has some internal variation. The most well-known distinction is the one between civic and ethnic nationalism, a differentiation suggested by the irrefutable difference between the French and the German models. However, even this distinction does not really capture the finer point that concerned Tagore. And we cannot express these distinctions with precision and accuracy by borrowing a terminology fashioned to make sense of European history. It is best to try to illustrate this point by closely reading some of Tagore's celebrated patriotic poems. Ashish Nandi, one of India's foremost political theorists, has made a cryptic remark in his work, which Giorgio mentioned, the illegitimacy of nationalism, that it's a mistake to characterize Tagore and Gandhi as two great figures of Indian nationalism. They were not nationalists, but patriots. I think this captures a very significant insight, but I would like to look into the logic of this argument more closely. Nandi explains that he views nationalism as a feeling of collective belonging that is centered on a state and not merely protects the people, but also in a certain sense gives the people their sense of identity. He's entirely right in stating that if nationalism is defined in this fashion, that is in a state-centric way, then Gandhi and Tagore are certainly not nationalists. The trouble with this argument is that it accepts without critical doubt an entirely Eurocentric conception of nationalism, because although there is a profound difference between civic and ethnic forms, they are both undoubtedly centered on the state and the ability of human beings to preemptively draw their primary identification from that state alone. To say that Tagore and Gandhi had a conception of civic or inclusive, pluralistic nationalism is certainly wrong, as Nandi maintains. This is something that is done in Indian writing very often, that Tagore's nationalism or Gandhi's nationalism is often seen as civic rather than ethnic. But I think that is deeply mistaken, because they do not want people's identity to focus on the state. So we have to engage in a double exercise of analyzing their actual modes of thinking and of theorizing them, this form of thinking in the context of academic discussions on nationalism. Tagore's nationalist poems were different, were written in the context of an emerging tradition of literary development in Bengali, an entirely innovative form of literary thinking about a nation imagined as a mother, which is the distinctive thing about India, that India doesn't have a conception of a fatherland, except that one of the great theorists of Hindu nationalism, whose work is being revived now, he occasionally refers to India as Pitribhumi, that is fatherland. But apart from him, I think practically everybody, including Hindu nationalists, refer to India as Matribhumi, that is the motherland, not the fatherland. So emerged through the literary works of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, whose novel Anandamot inaugurated this literary form. This novel also contained the first poetic composition of this kind, Bande Mataram, a song, an inspired but utterly exceptional digression into poetry and song by a writer who resolutely stuck to prose fiction all his life. Probably this indicated that there was a deep connection between sentiment and poetry. Affect is conveyed much more expressively in the language of poetry rather than in the unmusical language of prose. Bankim Chandra's initial creation, which did not follow up at all, spawned an immense literary genre of writing patriotic poetry and music in Bengali and in other languages. Fairly quickly, this genre went in the direction of all nationalist sentiments, probably everywhere in the world, towards an unrestrained, excessive adoration of the motherland as the best place in the world. As Voltaire famously said about this sentiment, it was a license to hate all nations except one's own. Dijendralal Roy, a talented poet and musician, composed one of the most famous instances of this genre of sentimental enthusiasm and literary surfeit. I'll give you the English translation of a stanza. In this earth, full of the bounties of wealth, food and flowers, there is one land that is the finest of all. It is made of the stuff of dreams and bounded by memories. You will find such a country nowhere else. She is the queen of all lands, queen of all countries, my motherland. Very popular, even today. When I was a school child, we regularly sort of sang this song with songs of Tagore. But when I started looking into them more closely, I found that they went in totally opposite directions. Enthusiasm is infectious and uncontrollable, and Roy's poem continues its cascading superlatives towards inevitable excess. Where do you get such mighty mountains and rivers? He asks, but more interestingly and peculiarly, where will one get such affection from brothers and mothers? So apparently in India, brothers and mothers are actually more affectionate than the rest of the world. The invocation of the motherland soon bursts all bonds of restraint, and the world becomes putatively a vast scene of contending, warring nations vying for glory. With time, this tradition of nationalist self-adoration becomes bolder and more extensive, spreading from the creation of literary word icons to visual ones, when the specular elements of iconicity are increasingly drawn from the repertoire of Hindu mythology and iconic devotion. The mother is always viewed as a goddess, often with many arms, in an iconic suggestion of infinite power, which is drawn from Hinduism. She is riding the lion, at times holding not bounties in her many arms, but weapons, eventually combining contradictory features. A very partial goddess, bounteous to her own children, and fearsome to everyone else. As I have written extensively about these themes in my recent book, I shall focus on aspects not covered in those previous readings. Ostensibly, it might appear that Tagore too wrote some poems that were similar in sentiment, like two celebrated patriotic poems about Bengal, one of which was turned into the national anthem of independent Bangladesh. The other song shows subtle reductions and inversions of these raging nationalist sentiments. One song acknowledges the feeling of blessedness in being born in this country and being blessed in its feeling of love. But in pointed reference to the Queen of all lands, which I quoted from this other poem, a tropic figure invoked by adorers of both Mother India and Britannia, it says, and I quote, "I do not know if you have riches worthy of a queen, but I know that my soul finds peace when I rest in your shadow." End of quote. Both poems, Tagore's and Roy's, are expressions of patriotic love to one's country seen as mother. But there is a stark contrast in the structure of feeling they express. In the first, the dominant sentiment is of exaltation, expressed in a language of majesty, competition, and eventually conquest, almost literally drawn from poetry that celebrated European figures of Britannia or France or Germania. The second poem expresses a sentiment of contentment, peace, and intimacy, the calm that descends on your soul in the presence and nearness of the familiar. Inhabitants of the land is in one case exultant because that nature and that earth is incomparable. In the other, it is calm and cooling because it is the world that is closest and familiar. It is true that both poems seek to express a form of devotion, but devotion of very different characters, because these are devotion to quite differently conceived deities. But the strangeness of Tagore's nationalism is expressed more forcefully in two other compositions which are celebrated as patriotic poems, but whose peculiarity within the genre is generally ignored. The first poem, Hey Mor Durbhaga Desh, begins with an address to my unfortunate land in a tone of sadness that is hardly ever assumed in this genre of poetic invocation. The whole poem is a litany of sadness at the wrongs that lie at the heart of India's past and present. Its primary theme is expressed in the initial lines: those you have wronged or humiliated, you have to earn an equality of humiliation with them, because those you pushed down would drag you down with them. Those you have left behind are dragging you from the back. On the day of the Creator's purifying wrath, at the door of a looming famine, this nation will have to learn the lesson of a putative, equal dignity that nationhood confers on every single member of its community. A second instance is a famous poem that celebrates India as a place of pilgrimage. It's called Bharat Tirtha. Tirtha is a place of pilgrimage in Sanskrit and Bengali, where all streams of humanity have come to find a common home. The poem repeats the urgings of the previous one about restitution of honor and love to those dishonored by Indians' history, but it stresses the openness of India's identity. Those who came down the stream of wars, that is Muslims, have become part of its soul. Even the West, which brings new gifts in a new age, must find a place in its heart. Tagore's famous novel Gora pushes the same kind of argument in a narrative form. It not merely states the equal belongingness of all India's traditional peoples, Hindus, Muslims, and Christians, but the entire narrative operation in Gora centers around a character who is the abandoned son of an Irish soldier during the mutiny of 1857, who thought of himself as a Hindu Brahmin. At the climactic point of the story, when he has to face the burden of his destiny, of his identity, the novel urges an adoption of a form of belonging, a definition of Indianness, in which this outsider, who is the son of a Christian Irish soldier, who is an enemy to the Indians by every definition, in which this outsider can be given unqualified acceptance, as interestingly, his illiterate Hindu mother had accepted him all his life. He had no father, only a mother, Only a mother could give people shelter in her calming shadow like that. That is the shadow that Tagore believes the nature of Bengal provided to her children. What is shown subtly in Gora at the level of personal destinies outlines a notion of care and motherhood that we can see transformed tropically to the figure of the iconic mother, who is a figure not of secular strife, but of a kind of cosmic tranquility. I want to finish with a reading of another layer of poetic operation in these two poems. All patriotic poems are usually celebrations of a collective self, but obviously nationalism is a highly political emotion, and it matters deeply who are included in the celebration of the collective self. For Savarkar, the Hindu nationalist, and his followers, the collective self is composed only of those for whom India is both the fatherland, Pitribhumi, and the holy land, Punyabhumi, by implication excluding Muslims and Christians. By contrast, Gandhi's collective self was generous and pluralist, embracing in its nation all who lived in India. We are used, however, to such differences in the definitions of the collective self. In these two poems by Tagore, there is a move that is more unusual and complex, and I think goes beyond this. Of course, Tagore sided with the definition of the self that worshipped the territory, literally, the land, which meant that its inhabitants shared the bounties and hardships of its nature, its common material culture, and were linked to it by the relationship of care that the mother had for her children. In that sense, Tagore's nation was the same as Gandhi's. But the actual presentation of the idea is subtly different, partly because it occurs in the terrain of art. What is truly remarkable in these poems is the crucial deferral of the celebratory moment of nationalism for this self. Take the first sentence of the poem. It says, "O my unfortunate land, those whom you have treated with insult, you have to become equal to them in humiliation." The use of the verbs contain a remarkable signal. The insult and indignity inflicted on parts of our own people has happened in the past and continues in the present. In Bengali, korecho. Korecho in Bengali grammar is a bland, generic past. What you have done. That can arch over past and present and past time. In the second phrase, hote hobe, you have to be, have to become, is in the future tense, setting up a deep temporal and practical rupture across this time, the time of the nation. The time of the nation is marked, tainted by its humiliation of its members. And Tagore's tone shows that in its present state, this collectivity, if you call it your nation, does not deserve any honor. Its celebration is conditional on its realizing what is implicit in its history, in its promise of fusion, directed at Muslims and Christians, and internal equality, repudiating the hierarchies of the Hindu caste system. Celebration of the nation is inappropriate in the present. It can only occur in an indefinite future. By this move, Tagore does something interesting to the idea of the nation, or collective identity. It is turned into what I would call a moral imaginary, an ideal of human belonging, which no state can historically realize, and which therefore can be used strategically as a ground from which actual states and their policies and their realization of the people nation can always be criticized and found wanting. Instead of becoming a principle of exclusion or an idea that serves to endorse the acts of a state, this idea of the ideal nation, the ideal sociability of its constituent peoples, becomes a weapon of social criticism. In trying to think through Ashish Nandi's interesting paradox that two of the greatest figures of Indian nationalism are not really nationalists, we are forced to open up a distinction between two notions of nationalism. The first meaning of nationalism is simply an intense sentiment of anti-colonialism, the idea that rule of one people by another is unjust and must end. The second meaning of nationalism is a sense of cohesion among a group of members of a state, that they are its nation, the people to whom this state belongs, who own this state, which immediately produces the implication that those who cannot crowd into that definition and its internal others, inhabitants of the same territory, but marooned outside this definition of a sacral collective self. Tagore was certainly a nationalist in the first sense, and certainly not in the second. But more significantly, from the point of view of political theory, his reflections around the idea of the modern nation, in both political writings and artistic reflection, suggests a larger question, whether the idea of the nation-state is the final destiny of all mankind, or should the political imagination of humanity set itself the task of thinking of some fundamentally different ways of organizing ordinary people's relation to political power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand his analysis of Tagore's critical nationalism has three key dimensions. One is world politics versus world politics, which has language matters. And the second is a power society, state-society relationship, which is also Tocqueville mentions. And the third dimension is collective identity and the concept of motherland. And those three dimensions are briefly can summarized. According to myself, my interpretation is language, institutions, and song. So I will get back some reaction from Jojo Shani.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Kaviraj for a very insightful and well-written keynote presentation. I always feel like I'm a graduate student when I listen to him, and it's very difficult to come up with a comment or a question which he hasn't already answered in the paper. So for the sake of the audience, I would like to perhaps engage with three main themes which may or can be applied outside of the specific case study of Tagore's work and his location within first Bengali and then Indian nationalist, if that's the correct word, thought. The first is the relationship between nationalism and modernity, which I think your paper deals with in great depth. I think a distinction has been made previously between the view of Tagore and Gandhi on modernity. Tagore's rejection of nationalism did not implicate modernity as a whole, but particular aspects of it. And in his work on nationalism, there's a certain defense of modernity as an attitude of perhaps critical reflection. This can contrast with Gandhianism, with rejection wholesale of Western modernity, of the concept of the nation state, and implicit rejection of capitalism and the imaginary of nationalism. In Bhikkhu Parekh's work on Gandhi, he describes Gandhi as a critical traditionalist. I think in the terms in that his thought was based very much on a Vedic cosmology, but he sought to look for areas and aspects in which it could be applied to the contemporary political views within India, and looked at the possibility of change. So in this sense, can we see Tagore as a critical modernist, as somebody with a critical perspective of modernity, but who bought into its central argument and central impulses? And if so, how does this link in with the argument made by Eisenstadt and others that we should reconceptualize modernity as multiple modernities rather than a multiple parts to a single modernity? Linked to this question would be the possibility of imagining the nation outside of territory, language, and religion in this sense. So on what basis can we construct a Bengali nation, an Indian nation, or even, to use the term of Ashish Nandi's terms, if we talk of patriotism, what really is the difference? Patriotism also reifies a certain understanding of territorial belonging and identification with a territory. To what extent is this encompassing or all-encompassing? Aren't there exclusions also built in with understandings of identification based on territory? And this leads us to a larger point on the untranslatability of concepts such as the nation into different cosmologies or into different languages in this sense. Interestingly, within Japanese, the consensus seems to be to look at nationalism or to define nationalism within katakana, which signifies its foreign origins. This is very different from the translation of nationalism as ethnic nationalism or imperial nationalism during the Second World War. So to what extent, by using the term nationalism, are we doing the work of nationalists for them? Are we universalizing and reproducing this primary identification of humanity with a particular territory, language, religion, etc.? So to what extent are we reifying particularity in this sense? I would like to conclude by suggesting that perhaps if we are going to look beyond nationalism, then we may need to look for a different conceptual vocabulary from the one which we are using and operating in right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor. A couple of questions. Time is limited, so any questions? Okay, one, two.
Father Paul Koroluk, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate. Forgive me, this is a very emotional issue for me. Currently, my country is invaded by another country which is phrasing its aggressive war against my nation as a war against nationalism. I very much appreciated your presentation, Professor, and I very am a great fan of the deep work of Professor Tagore in recognizing the natural concept of a nation that we can approach critically. Pope John Paul II spoke of patriotism and nationalism, a love for one's country and its people as being a natural extension of our commandment to love our neighbor. You spoke, Professor Shani, about us doing the work of nationalists. And I'm very much afraid today that a lot of the language that's been used in the introduction and in these summary presentations speaks uncritically against nationalism. And I'm wondering if this fundamentalist anti-nationalism doesn't in itself create a reaction of excessive nationalism by the nationalists and allow imperial or aggressors to use the concept of nationalism is an excuse for creating the violence and the war that we are professing to protect people against. Do you have any thoughts on more nuanced thoughts on that, Professor?
Yep, Professor Ichijo.
That was supposed to be a question.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your talk, and it had a lot of food for thought. Just referring to your one of the points about untranslatability of the sense of belonging to collectivity, and I think you spoke of the inappropriateness of using nationalism to describe this belonging. I'm just wondering if this can be somehow dealt with by separating state and nation clearly. And perhaps that might be one way of dealing with this conceptual issue if we cannot come up with new terminology, new concept, as it were.
Thank you. I think, all the questions are wonderful. I don't want to take too long in responding to them. First, the questions from Giorgio on nationalism and modernity, Tagore and Gandhi. That, I think, is a very interesting and important point. That Gandhi and Tagore they had critical reactions to Western modernity. I now use the term Western modernity in a sense which is slightly odd, slightly different from the conventional use. In the conventional use, Western modernity essentially means that modernity is by definition Western. But the way I think about modernity, Western modernity needs to be marked, because modernity outside the West is sometimes fundamentally different from the Western. So when I use the term Western modernity, what I mean by that is rather different. But both of them, I think, responded critically and very powerfully to the structures of Western modernity. And as Giorgio said, I entirely agree with him that Gandhi's response to Western modernity is of a kind of comprehensive rejection. Although, if you look at Gandhi closely, you will see that there are many moves in Gandhi's own thinking and practice, which were not possible if Gandhi did not incorporate into his thinking and his political action a lot of things which originated in the West. Which is not surprising, because thinkers are not always entirely clear about all the influences on their thinking. And so I think Gandhi creates an exaggerated sense of his non-Westernness for political and ideological purposes. But I think there's a very big difference between Tagore and Gandhi on this question. And I just wanted to illustrate that point because it's very important for Tagore. I think Giorgio is exactly right in saying that Tagore applied a principle of critical rationalism. And I think I would generalize even more and say that for Tagore, modernity actually meant the capacity to apply critical rationalism. And quite often he makes an argument of this kind, which I think people in countries like Japan and India should look at with greater care and also use more often. He would say that suppose there's some kind of institution of social life where Indians do it in one way and modern European modernity does it in a very different way. Now, the conventional form of thinking during his time would be that the Indian way of doing that is backward and the European way of doing it is more advanced, and we should go over to that. If you do not do that, then we remain traditional. I think the subtlety in Tagore's argument is that Tagore would say that if you keep on carrying on the Indian institution simply because it has been done that way by your forefathers, then you are traditional. But suppose I get into a debate about how that institution, let's say the family, functions in the West and functions in India. And after critical reflection, I come down on the side of the Indian family, broadly. And I say that, the Indian family, I like the Indian family better. But not because it is Indian, but because after an elaboration of the different principles, advantages, disadvantages, etc., my judgment falls on its side. Now, the crucial point in Tagore is that this judgment or this position is not a traditional position, because it defends the Indian family or defends that institution, not by an argument of traditionalism, but by an argument of modernity. So if Tagore says that, this is something which I find persuasive, preferable, I want to do it this way, but it is a way in which things have been done in Indian culture before. His argument is that you should not accuse me of traditionalism. You should actually accuse me of modernity in a certain sense, because it's very much part of a modern reflection about the world, because its central principle is the principle of critical rationality. So that's why I think it's very, very important. Link of this debate to multiple modernity, it's already indicated in what I said, that it's obviously linked to multiple modernity, particularly Tagore, not so much Gandhi. But if you take Tagore seriously, I think, and if you bring out the implications of what he writes, it pushes inevitably, towards a theory of multiple modernity. And what do we do with the term nation? Is patriotism a better term? I think in some ways it is. Ashish Nandi, as we were discussing last night, he's a very insightful thinker, but he's not very patient in the sense that he doesn't take time to elaborate the basis of his arguments or the implications of his arguments. I think patriotism appeals to him because nation basically means that there is some group of people, an identifiable group of people, who constitute this collective identity. Patriotism refers more, I think, to a territory and history. So anybody who has been part of that territory and that history, if you can, slightly paradoxically, use the term inhabitants of that history, then all of them are equally entitled, to belongingness to that collectivity. So from that point of view, if you use the term patriotism that way, then it might be better, in a sense, to using the term nation. I want to make a final point in response to what Giorgio said, hoping that later on we could probably have a discussion about this. This was also mentioned in a slightly different way by the remarks by Professor Mori initially. Although your remarks were very brief, I think you touched on something which is very central. I think the Indian state, now I'm not talking vaguely of configuration of power, etc. I'm talking of the constitution of the Indian state. I think the Indian state is not a nation state in the sense of a European definition of the nation state. And many critical thinkers in India, among social scientists, historians, they have, sort of rummaged in the language of social science for a word which can capture this, and essentially saying that it's not a nation state. We should call it by some other name, but it's not easy to find a name which actually expresses it quite felicitously. But patriotism also has a connection with that, because if you look at the kind of identity that the Indian state incorporates into the constitution. For instance, when I went to school, let me give you a more biographical, simple-minded example. When I went to school, I learned that I was a Bengali. I was also an Indian, right? And when I looked around a little bit intelligently, I could also see that there was no way in which somebody could be just an Indian, who is not a Bengali, not a Tamil, not a Punjabi. He's nothing, only an Indian. It was impossible for somebody to be an Indian in that sense. In order to be Indian, you had to be something else also, because that was your route to becoming an Indian in a certain sense. Now, I think the Indian constitution, the Constituent Assembly debates were very rich, detailed, and I think they were very insightful in some ways, because they thought that the debate in the Constituent Assembly, I think, was about this question, that we have to be a successful state, and the only historical precedents of successful states are European nation states. So what kind of state should we become? And there's a view, which is coming from the Hindu right particularly, which says that we must be a nation state, and therefore we must be like European nation states, single territory, single language, single religion, and things like that, right? Now, I think the Constitution eventually rejects that and goes into a state form, which I think is a kind of modernized version of something that we have had in India in pre-modern times, an imperial state kind of structure, where you can be patriotic about your region, and you can also be patriotic about India. And I think if you look at Pakistan, which is a very interesting contrast, this is not an India-Pakistan conflict kind of issue, but I think it illustrates an important point. Because Pakistan sociologically and culturally is very similar to India. But the Pakistani leadership, immediately after independence, thought that, I think mistakenly, that they were sitting on a country which was very, very united, because it was a country of Muslims of South Asia. So that was homogeneous, whereas India was a totally heterogeneous place, right? And because of that, when there were pressures, for the recognition of homogeneity in Pakistan, from Bengalis, for instance, the Pakistani leadership did not accommodate that. The Pakistani leadership's response was a hostile response and tried to suppress that, which exploded after some time. I think in India, there was an interesting case when Nehru, immediately after granting the states reorganization, he suggested, he was concerned and troubled about that, and he suggested that state governments, when they write to each other and they write to the central government, they should probably write in Hindi rather than in English, right? And there was a huge uproar about that, and particularly there was pushback from two states, Tamil Nadu and my own state, West Bengal. And what is interesting about Nehru was that instead of trying to repress that and push forward, Nehru actually went back, retreated on that issue. And he said that, well, if you feel that this is imposition of Hindi and a homogeneous kind of cultural nationalism, I would retreat. I don't want to do that. So I think what is implicit in the making of the Indian Constitution is a crafting of a structure of identity, which acknowledges the multi-layered identity that people have in India. the naturalness in a certain sense, not naturalness in a completely natural sense, but naturalness in a historical sense, of people having an identity of being a Bengali and an Indian and things like that. And because of that, I think the Indian constitution is more sensitive to demands of identity of very different kinds. And it has allowed India, I think, to be more successful. Because I think the principal insight that I find working behind the Indian constitution is that if you have a society which is so internally diverse, if you want to apply a homogenizing European-style ideal of a nation-state on it, it wouldn't work. It would actually, it would break apart. Now the two questions are very interesting. To the first question, I think, people like Tagore would probably say, what I wanted to bring out in my paper is that the reason why I'm slightly critical of Harshi Nandi is that he makes such a stark distinction between nationalism and patriotism. And as I said, if you think of anti-colonial nationalism, Tagore and Gandhi, Tagore included, was a strong anti-colonial nationalist, if you call that nationalism. That we can actually extrapolate from that and then turn to the question that you asked, which is relevant today. But I think it's actually relevant everywhere, that the justification of these things are not transcendental justification. These must be conjunctural justification. So if my country is invaded by somebody and occupied, then obviously there is something which is just and right in feeling a sense of nationalism. And there again, you will see that the sense of nationalism is very similar, very parallel to anti-colonial nationalism. So I would argue that it is hazardous to think of a kind of justification of things like nationalism, which tends to be ahistorically, transcendently true. I think it's much better to think of these things as justifiable under particular historical conjunctures. And the last point about separating state and nation, that's a very, very good point. And I can only report to you something that some scholars in India suggest, that we can also, I touched on it very briefly towards the end of my lecture, because I think there is a certain strand of thinking like that in Tagore as well, that you can think of the nation and the state in two ways. The standard ways of thinking of the state and the nation is to see the state as a body and the nation as the soul kind of thing, or the mind of behind that, animating that body, which means that they are very similar, right? And they are homologous in a certain sense. The other way of thinking of the state and the nation is to separate them radically, and to say that state is something which is historically realized in a form of the exercise of power. And therefore it must do things which are unjustifiable, which are oppressive, which are ethically questionable in all kinds of ways. And let us separate the term nation from that, right? And put the nation in the level of, as I called, a moral imaginary. Imaginary basically means that we are not talking about something which is real, right? But that does not mean, because it's not real, that it's not of real value. Its value is that it actually exists and shines in a certain sense as a repository of all our hopes and aspirations and ideals. So the nation is the place, or the nation is the concept into which we sort of throw all our dreams in a certain sense. And if you take that seriously, then as a constitution, in a certain sense, restrains, the activity of people who are wielders of power, public officials. The relationship between that kind of conception of a nation and a state could be similar, in the sense that, then the nations become something in the name of which you can always criticize the state. You can call this state to, you can actually subject the state to criticism continually in the name of that nation. And there is I think if you look at Indian nationalism, particularly Indian nationalist poetry, fiction and things like that, there is a tendency of that kind, that, that you think of the nation like that, where some people would argue that what's the value of doing that because it's completely idealistic. I think if you're a really shrewd student of politics, you'll see that politics is very deeply moved by ideals of that kind. So I think it's a good move, and I think there is to some extent, this is something that you can already see in the literature of Indian nationalism.
Thank you very much, Professor Kabilaji. Let me conclude the first plenary session now. Thank you. Before lunch break, I would like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements for the audience. The University Dining Hall downstairs of this building is not available for the audience today. We apologize for the inconvenience due to a faculty Christmas event. But instead, you can, audience can use ICU High School dining hall. So if you have needed some hot meal, please go to the ICU High School dining hall. And also, some light meals like sandwiches or rice balls are available of the second floor shopping, second floor university shop bookstore of the Diffendorfer building. Okay, it's closed. There is also some eating space, the first floor of the Diffendorfer building. So please walk around on the campus, beautiful campus. And this room is not allowed for eating, so please ask some of our staff for some eating space. And if you use a microphone, simultaneous translation for speakers, please return to the desk during a lunch break. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.